I got drunk at my son's 5th birthday party, stood up in front of 40 people, and toasted the man who was actually his father. My husband was 6 feet away holding a plate of cake. I thought I was finally being honest. I thought the people who mattered would understand. What I did not know was that someone was already filming. My husband's aunt had heard everything I said on the terrace 20 minutes earlier, and the man I had been protecting for 8 months would not answer my calls by morning. My name is Isolde Marchetti. I am 32 years old, and I coordinate events for a mid-size hospitality company. The flowers, the lighting, the precise arrangement of chairs that tells a guest everything is under control. I am good at this, and I apply it everywhere, including my marriage, which had required considerable management for the past year, and my evenings, which had begun to require a different kind of arrangement entirely. Warren is 36, a structural engineer who brings the same careful precision to arguments and silence that he brings to load-bearing walls. He was not a cruel man. He was an exact one, which I had always found harder to manage, and I had spent 2 years telling myself the gap between us was his fault rather than a decision I had quietly made and stopped examining. The other arrangement was Callum Rees, Warren's best friend from university, a freelance architect, warm in the way men are when they want something without the full cost of wanting it. He had been in our lives for years, a presence so familiar he did not register as dangerous, until one evening he was not furniture at all. The affair had been running for 8 weeks. I preferred the word company. It began properly on the rooftop terrace of our apartment building on a Tuesday night at 11:10. I told Warren I was stepping out for air and instead stood above the Holt Street corridor with my phone pressed to my ear, listening to Callum talk about Theo's upcoming 5th birthday. Callum said he wanted to be there, at the party, in the room. I told him I would figure it out. 3 blocks away, Meridian Tower glowed at the end of the street, lit at all hours, and I did not think about it in any meaningful way. Warren was on the sofa when I came back in, his mug sitting long past warm on the coffee table. He asked, in a tone that was level and clearly deliberate, who I had been talking to on the roof. He kept it logistical. He said the Tuesday and Thursday pattern of late calls was affecting how he planned Theo's morning pickups, and he needed to know whether it was shifting further into the week. His tone was not combative, which was somehow worse. I told him colleagues in different time zones existed and that cataloguing his wife's rooftop usage was an unhealthy relationship with surveillance. I took the mug to the kitchen and did not look at him. He did not follow. The next morning I told my colleague Priya everything as a story in which I was clearly the reasonable one. She said I deserved better, and I believed her because I had been wanting to for a long time. I was also finalising Theo's birthday. Birchwood event hall booked, 5-tier train cake ordered, 40-person guest list nearly done. I added Callum under family and close friends without mentioning it to Warren. I told myself it was obvious. Callum was Warren's best friend after all, and his presence needed no explanation. The fact that I had not explained it was a detail I chose not to examine. That evening at the Yard wine bar, I paid for the second round on the household card and logged it as client entertaining, the way I had been doing for 6 weeks without thinking about who might eventually look at the pattern. When I came home, Warren was in the kitchen with Theo's latest painting drying on the counter, stick figures, and, in the corner, one labelled C in careful 5-year-old handwriting. Warren asked Theo gently who C was. Theo said he was Mummy's friend from the phone. Warren waited until Theo was in bed, then asked me how Theo knew that name and when a phone contact had become part of our son's birthday planning. He said he had seen the Birchwood confirmation arrive at the shared household inbox and was asking in good faith how someone reached a 40-person guest list without a single conversation. I told him Theo had a rich imagination and that conducting an inquiry over a child's drawing was the most exhausting thing I had heard all week. I went to the living room. From the hallway I heard a brief electronic chime, the kind a cloud backup makes when it finishes, and told myself it was his work tablet syncing overnight. The home office light stayed on for another hour after I went to bed. In the morning, Theo told Warren over cereal that C from the drawing was coming to the party because Mummy said so. Warren poured his coffee, wrote something in the small notebook on the kitchen counter, closed it, and put it in his bag without saying what he had written or why. 3 days later, Warren had the shared expense app open on the kitchen table when I came home. The screen turned toward me so I could see the specific entry. The Yard Wine Bar, Tuesday evening, $63, categorized as client hosting, time-stamped at 9:44 p.m. He asked, in his administrative and careful tone, what the client's name was, because he needed to understand whether this was a legitimate deductible before he submitted the quarterly household accounts to their accountant. His voice was completely even. He said the timestamp showed a departure at 9:44 and that I had told him I would be back by 8 that evening for Theo's bedtime, and that the difference between those two times was something he was asking me to explain. He said he was not accusing her of anything. He was asking a logistical question, naming the specific charge and the specific discrepancy, and the explanation would be helpful for planning the following Tuesday around school pickup. I told him I was not going to provide an itemized social dossier for every evening I spent with colleagues, and that using a household expense app as an interrogation instrument was controlling behavior I did not intend to reward with detail. I picked up my bag and went to the bedroom. He was still at the table. She heard him close the app. She heard him type something brief. She heard nothing else. The next morning, Warren was gone 40 minutes earlier than usual, with no explanation offered. On the shared wall calendar near the kitchen, there was a new entry in his handwriting. Alderton Avenue, 8:15 a.m. When I asked about it at breakfast, he said it was a rescheduled site visit. He ate his toast, kissed Theo on the forehead, and left without a further word. I looked at the entry again after the door closed. Alderton Avenue was not near any of his firm's current projects. I knew this because I had looked at his work schedule on the shared calendar enough times to know where his sites were. At the daycare pickup that afternoon, Helen, a mother from Theo's class whose husband worked in the same building as Warren's consultancy, pulled her car in beside mine and mentioned, with the easy tone of someone making small talk, that she had seen my silver car outside the yard on the Tuesday evening in question. She was walking her dog and had noticed it because of the distinctive colour. I smiled and said I had been at a client meeting nearby and used that stretch of street for parking convenience. Helen nodded and moved on to the school fundraiser. I watched the back of her head after she turned away and calculated how far that detail might travel in the school parent network between now and the end of the week. When Warren came home from the Alderton Avenue appointment, he was different in a way I could not name precisely but could not dismiss. He made Theo's dinner, bathed him, read to him, and came back to the kitchen without the particular tension that usually preceded an argument. There was no tension, which meant there was no gap for an argument to start in. He was contained, and the containment was new. Then he asked me, sitting across the kitchen table with Theo's drawings still spread on the counter behind him, whether Callum had been added to the party guest list and how that decision had been reached without a conversation. He named the Birchwood venue confirmation email, which had come to the shared household address and which he had seen in the inbox earlier that day before the tab was closed. He said he was not objecting to Callum's presence. Callum was his oldest friend. But he was asking why a notable decision about his son's party had been made without being mentioned, and whether the reason for not mentioning it was something they needed to discuss. His phone lit up on the table, contact name replaced with a small grey envelope emoji she had never seen before, and dimmed again before she could read the preview. I told him he was turning something straightforward into something complicated, that Callum had been his friend for 15 years, and that no further explanation was owed. I said goodnight. He did not say it back. Before bed, I posted a photograph I had been keeping in reserve. Callum and me at a bar 3 weeks earlier, his arm resting on the chair behind me, both of us mid-laugh and close enough that the proximity was immediately legible. I captioned it for the ones who get it. I knew Warren followed the account. 41 people responded within the hour. Warren viewed it and did not react, which I took as confirmation that the post had landed the way I intended. In the morning, his car was gone before I was up, and on the kitchen calendar there was a new entry below the Alderton Avenue one, Ferris Row, 11 a.m. At the preschool pickup that week, Theo climbed into the back seat and asked whether C was coming to his party because he was his other daddy. I stopped the car in the middle of the pickup flow, collected myself, and explained, in a careful and cheerful voice, that Callum was Daddy's friend and that everyone had lots of friends, and that was what friends did. Theo looked out the window and nodded in the way 5-year-olds do when they accept an answer that does not fully satisfy them. I checked the rearview mirror and kept my breathing even. I did not know whether he had said this before to Warren, to Diana, to anyone. At work the following day, Khaled, the senior property manager, whose client portfolio overlapped with Warren's brokerage contacts, stopped me in the corridor and said, without any particular expression, that Warren had called the front desk asking whether I had a client meeting scheduled on the Tuesday in question. The receptionist had told him I did not. Khaled delivered this as a fact, not a judgment, and continued down the corridor. The building was quiet behind him. I stood where I was for a moment and then walked in the other direction. The morning of the party, I drove to the supply store on the Holt Street commercial strip to collect the table runners, metallic balloons, and the train theme banner Theo had chosen after considerable deliberation at the shop's sample wall. I had told Warren I was going alone. Callum met me in the car park. We loaded everything into my car together, and the back seat filled with the smell of fresh metallic plastic and a trace of Callum's jacket from when he leaned across to fit the banner roll along the seat. A woman in a silver store vest watched from the doorway, and I registered her the way you register something inconsequential and do not carry it with you. We drove to the venue in separate cars. The Birchwood event hall was booked from noon, and Warren arrived exactly on time with Theo, who ran straight to the cake table to confirm that the 5-tier train design had been executed to specification. Warren spent the first hour helping the venue staff arrange the chairs around the long central table, taking photographs of Theo examining each cake carriage with the focused attention of a child who has been thinking about this cake for 3 weeks and speaking to no one in a way that required performance. He was simply doing what he always did, being present for Theo without announcement. Callum arrived at 2, just before the main wave of guests, and Warren greeted him with the warmth of 15 years of friendship, an easy and genuine greeting that I watched from across the room and took as confirmation that the situation was manageable. I was the one who pulled Callum into photographs. I was the one who steered him toward the bar cart, while Warren stayed near his mother and near Nate at the long table end. I told myself this was natural arrangement, that I was simply being a good host. I told myself a great number of things in those first 2 hours that turned out not to matter. I started drinking at 2:30. The guests were the usual arrangement: Diana and Aunt Ruth on Warren's side near the long table, Priya and 2 work colleagues, Nate and 2 neighbourhood couples who knew both of them, Isolde's cousin and her partner near the back. The party was warm and ordinary for exactly 2 hours. Theo ran between the play corner and the cake table. Warren stayed close to him, crouched down to hear everything he said, and was in every way that counted the more present parent in the room. At 3:15, I slipped out to the back stone terrace with Callum for what I described as a minute of air. The terrace door was left open behind us. The cold January air came in and mixed with the warmth of the hall, carrying the smell of the just-blown birthday candles, a thin thread of wax smoke drifting outward through the gap. We were out there for 12 minutes, and I was on my 3rd drink. I told Callum, in the voice of someone who has been careful for a long time and has stopped being careful, that Theo looked more like him every month and that I thought Warren had started to notice. I said this clearly and without a lowered voice because I believed the terrace was private and the door gap was small. I did not know that Aunt Ruth was near the hallway entrance 3 feet from the open door, holding a glass of water and standing perfectly still. At 3:30, I picked up a glass at the bar cart and tapped it. The room settled. I began with Theo, his laugh, the train phase, the exact drawing he had made for me last Tuesday. And the first 30 seconds were received warmly. People were smiling. Warren was at the far end of the long table holding Theo's paper party plate, watching me with the composed expression of a man who had prepared himself to remain composed regardless of what happened next. Then I said that I wanted to raise a glass to the real men who truly saw Theo, the ones who showed up for a child out of genuine feeling rather than obligation. I looked at Callum. I raised my glass toward him. The room went into the specific silence that follows something that cannot be walked back before any person has decided how to respond. Priya was looking at the floor. Diana had set her fork down and become still. Aunt Ruth was 3 feet away. Nate's hand went to Warren's forearm. Callum's glass was half raised, and his expression, and this is the detail that Aunt Ruth would later describe in one steady sentence, was not surprise. Warren's face did not change. Someone at the back had a phone angled toward the bar cart. The birthday candles had already been blown out, and the wax smoke still drifted above the cake table. A tentative clap started at the edge of the crowd. It did not spread. The party continued for 40 more minutes in the way parties do after something has been said that everyone chooses not to name out loud. Diana said goodbye to Theo first, and left without looking at me. Callum made his exit early, claiming an early morning, and the brief handoff with Warren at the door was even and quiet. Aunt Ruth found Priya near the drinks table and said something brief to her. Priya nodded and did not look in my direction again. Warren lifted Theo at the end of the evening, gathered all his gifts, told me in a voice that was neither warm nor cold that he would take Theo home, and left with Nate walking them to the car. I stood at the bar cart with my 5th drink and told myself the toast had been emotional and everyone needed to take a breath. At 9:40 that night, my phone lit up with a message from a number I did not recognize. A 10-second screen recording. The angle was from the back of the room. The audio was clear. The words were mine. The recording had already been forwarded to 4 other numbers, all visible in the thread preview before the screen locked. Warren made Theo's breakfast in the morning after quiet, the heavy kind that comes after something has settled into the floor overnight. Theo ate cereal in the living room. Warren came to stand across from me at the kitchen table and asked what I had meant when I said the real men who see Theo. He named the sentence. He said it plainly and calmly, and asked whether I had intended to communicate something about Theo's paternity in front of 40 guests, including his mother and his aunt, and whether I would like to tell him now, privately, what I had been saying to the room. His voice did not shake. I had been preparing for this since the screen recording arrived, and I delivered the play I had built overnight. I told him I had been struggling, genuinely and seriously, with the weight of feeling invisible in this marriage, and that the toast was an emotional overflow of real pain made clumsy by a drink too many, and that his immediate clinical response, documented discrepancies, demand for explanation, was exactly the pattern that had made the marriage so difficult to stay present inside. I said it as though it were honesty. He listened to every word. Then he asked whether I would agree to a private DNA test, done quickly between the 2 of them, before the question went further. I said no and told him the question was an insult to Theo. He said the toast had raised it publicly and a private answer was less damaging than a public question left open. I said that was not my problem to fix. He dried his hands on the kitchen towel, hung it back on the hook with the same precise action he brought to everything, and went to get Theo ready for nursery. The controlled empathy play did not survive contact with what Aunt Ruth had already sent him. I found this out 2 days later at Diana's Sunday lunch. Diana had set the table with her usual care. 4 places, good plates, everything in its position. The meal moved carefully for 40 minutes. Theo drew at the end of the table and the adults ate with the particular deliberateness of people holding something back. Then Diana looked at me and said, in the measured tone of a woman who had thought carefully about each word, that what had been said at the party had been heard by people who loved Warren and Theo, and that pretending otherwise was something she could not do. She said it was not about anger, she said this specifically. It was about what was said and what it meant, and whether anyone at the table planned to act as though they had not heard it. I told her she was amplifying a personal and complicated situation. She said she was not amplifying anything, she was naming it, and she said it without raising her voice, which was worse. After that, the meal moved in near silence. Warren and Theo washed the dishes. Diana sat at the table and looked past me at the wall. I left as soon as it was possible to leave without making the exit itself a statement. At work, I intercepted Priya in the car park and asked her to sit with me for 15 minutes. I gave her the full emotional context, the loneliness in the marriage, the pressure, the toast as an accident of feeling made public by one drink too many. And I asked, plainly, whether she would be willing to say, if anyone asked, that I had been visibly distressed that afternoon and not fully in control of my words. Priya was quiet for a stretch that felt much longer than it was. Then she said she could not do that. She said she had been in the room and had heard what was said and knew what it meant, and she was not going to say anything that contradicted it. She said she was sorry. She unlocked the car doors. I got out. That same week, Warren attended another early appointment, the Strand office entry that had appeared on the calendar. He came home at midday and had moved his side of the wardrobe into the spare room, citing a preference for a separate morning routine. His keys were on a different ring. The spare key I sometimes borrowed was no longer on it. He said none of this dramatically. He mentioned it the way you mention a practical household change. That evening he asked me, referencing Aunt Ruth's message to him. He described its contents with borrowed precision, repeating what she had written. Whether I would agree one more time to a private test before the matter moved to a different stage. He asked what I wanted Theo to understand, in 2 or 5 or 10 years, about the choice I made in this particular conversation. He said it was not a threat. I told him the vocabulary of documented stages and processes was the vocabulary of a man who had decided to be my adversary and was disguising it as reason. He said he had not shown me any paperwork. He said good night. That night I heard the printer from the hallway. 1 page, the soft feed of the roller, the hum of completion. In the morning, the output tray was empty. The printer screen showed document, 1 page, 11:47 p.m. Whatever had been printed was already somewhere I was not going to find it. The following afternoon, Theo asked at the kitchen table mid-drawing whether C was his daddy too. I said no and kept my voice ordinary. He said someone at the party told him something about his family and they had grey hair. I looked across the room at Warren, who was looking at something on his phone, face up. He turned it face down when he saw me looking. The screen dimmed before I could read it. He put the phone in his jacket pocket and said nothing. The kitchen was very quiet. 2 days after the kitchen conversation, I sat across from Warren at the table and delivered what I had decided was a significant concession. I told him that the connection with Callum had grown into something it should not have, that it had gone further than was right, and that I was willing to end all contact completely if he agreed to leave the paternity question where it was and not pursue it further. I kept my voice measured and reasonable, the voice I used in professional negotiations when I needed the other party to feel they were being genuinely met. He turned from the coffee maker and asked, immediately and without hesitation, when the contact had started. I gave him a date in mid-October. He named a dashcam timestamp from level B2 of the building garage, Callum's car, a Thursday evening in mid-August, the plate confirmed. The controlled bargain had less than a minute of life. I told him he had misidentified the car. He said the plate matched. I took my coffee to the bedroom. The following morning I posted a story on social media describing the past several days as what happens when people project their own insecurities onto someone who is simply trying to live with honesty. I knew Diana would see it. I knew Priya would see it. I knew Nate would show Warren. I posted it anyway because the bargain had failed, and I needed to be louder than what was being assembled against me, and being louder had always worked before. By midday, Nate had forwarded it to Warren with a single line attached. Diana sent me a message saying she thought I should focus on Theo and stop. I reposted the story with a coffee emoji. 3 days later, I came down to the building gym corridor at 6:45 to find Warren returning from an early session, gym bag over one shoulder, towel across his arm, smelling of clean exertion and the slightly metallic air of the basement floor. I told him I was there because I wanted to have a real conversation, an adult one, and he stopped and waited without expression. I said I wanted us to put Theo's well-being at the centre and not let the situation become something that damaged him. Warren asked, without warmth or sharpness, whether I had taken the social media story down. I said the story was not the relevant issue. He asked what I had meant by projecting insecurities, given that I had posted it 4 hours after he named a timestamp that directly contradicted the date I had given him. He asked whether I understood what the combination of the party toast and the story communicated to the people in our shared circle who had seen both. I told him the post had not been about him, and that placing himself at the centre of my private expression was a habit he ought to examine. He said he was asking about the paternity of his son, and my answer was a social media story, and that he was going to handle what needed to be handled in the correct way. He said it without heat, the way you confirm a scheduled next step. He walked to the elevator. I stood where I was and watched the doors close. That afternoon, I came out to the building car park and saw him loading a cardboard box into the boot of his car. Not heavy from how he carried it, the kind of weight that comes from organised documents rather than objects. I asked what it was. He said files he was moving to a colleague's secure storage. He closed the boot, locked the car, and I noticed again that it was facing outward toward the street, the way it had been positioned every single day for the past 2 weeks. As he shut the driver's door, I had 2 seconds of angle on the passenger seat, and in those 2 seconds, I saw the corner of a manila envelope underneath it, thicker than a standard letter, the kind that holds a formal arrangement of multiple documents, before the door closed and the angle was gone. He went inside. I stood in the driveway looking at his car and did not follow him in. That night, the Home Office was closed from 9. I stood in the hallway twice and did not knock. Through the door gap, I could see the desk lamp and the laptop screen. 2 cloud sync chimes sounded, each brief and separate with a pause between them. A low voice for 6 minutes, muffled and unhurried, the pace of a call being given full attention. At 11, the light went off. His phone was on the kitchen counter when I went for water, and a notification fired and lit the screen for 2 seconds. TW, 9 a.m. On the wall calendar, in fresh ink below everything else, was a new entry. Tower Street, 9 a.m., Thursday. Thursday was 2 days away. The following evening, Warren settled Theo to bed, read to him, and came into the living room and sat in the chair across from me. The chair, not the sofa, and said, in the quietest voice she had heard from him in 7 years, that he had asked her the same core question across 12 separate conversations in 4 months, and that he was done asking. He said he would handle what needed to be handled in an orderly way based on what was documented, with Theo's well-being as the central concern throughout. He did not list anything. He said she had had every opportunity to speak honestly and had chosen not to, and he was now going to exercise his own options. He said goodnight and went to the spare room with his pillow and closed the latch. Once. Firmly. Thursday morning, the apartment was empty before I woke. On the kitchen counter, where the household notebook had always lived, was a single sheet of white paper, Theo's school pickup schedule, formatted and timed and signed with Warren's initials, precisely centred. The tidiest thing in the room. I called Callum. No answer. My calendar alert fired at 9:10. Tower Street, 9 a.m. Priya called shortly after and said carefully that Nate had asked her the previous day whether she had a direct contact for a civil legal services registrar near their postcode. I sat at the table with the pickup schedule in front of me and understood, with the particular clarity of something that has always been true, that the quiet I had been reading as surrender had been something else from the beginning. The Meridian Tower lobby was 3 blocks from our apartment building on the same Holt Street I had looked at from the rooftop on the night this all began. I arrived at 9:55 believing a message from an unknown number had confirmed a mediation appointment. I checked in at reception and received a visitor badge. 3 people were in the lobby: a man in a navy suit, a woman near the desk holding a sealed envelope with a red security tab, and Warren's Aunt Ruth, seated by the window with a plain folder and the expression of someone who had already done what she came to do. Warren was not in the building. The woman called my full legal name. I confirmed it. She handed me the envelope and noted the time on a pad. Inside was a petition for dissolution of marriage with temporary parental responsibility orders already in motion. Attached was a court-ordered paternity test notice scheduling Theo, myself, and Warren at an accredited lab the following Tuesday at 2 o'clock. Below both was an evidence schedule, dashcam timestamps from level B2 on 4 dates, expense app charges at the yard with times and amounts, a screenshot of the social media story, a screen recording of the birthday toast, time-coded 3:33 p.m., full audio, Aunt Ruth's signed witness statement, 1 paragraph describing what she heard through the open terrace door, and a dated timeline of 12 dialogue attempts across 4 months, ending with a single entry logging the time I declined the private DNA test and noting that no further attempts had been made by the petitioner. I told the front desk manager there had been a misunderstanding. She said pleasantly she was only the front desk. The man in the navy suit said service was completed and the hearing date was on the first page. Aunt Ruth looked at me once and looked back at her folder. I called Warren. I called Callum. Neither answered. What I believed was strength was arriving at any situation before the story could be told about it. I named his questions paranoia and his timestamps obsession and his patient's passivity, and it worked for as long as the room held only my version. But the dashcam did not contain versions. The expense record was a list of times and amounts. Aunt Ruth's statement was 1 paragraph of what she heard, not a narrative with a narrator. The quieter he became, the more he built from the material I gave him every time I was certain I had won. The paternity test took place on Tuesday at the Ferris Row lab. The results confirmed what she had already known. The household card was declined at the grocery checkout that Friday with 6 people in the line behind her. The shared group chat with the neighbourhood couples sat at her last message, unanswered for 11 days. Callum sent 4 sentences saying his situation had become complicated and that space was probably best. She did not reply. One evening she stood at the apartment door and looked down the Holt Street corridor toward the glass lobby of Meridian Tower, lit at all hours the way it always was, 3 blocks away. She had looked at it from the rooftop on the night this began and had not thought about it at all. She closed the door.